Death in the Christmas Butterfly House. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore the complexities of human nature through tales as intricate as the most delicate butterfly wing. I'm your host, William, and today I'm honoured to bring you a mystery, observed through the keen eyes of Miss Marple, our beloved detective. You know, mysteries have a way of finding us in the most unexpected places, even during a celebration meant to bring joy. Before we begin this intricate tale of deception and tragedy, I'd love to know from which corner of the world you're listening today. Your stories matter to me, as does this one we're about to unravel together. So settle in, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, and let us step into the world of the Grandview Tropical Conservatory, where not all butterflies are as harmless as they appear. Let's begin. Death in the Christmas Butterfly House. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Conservatory. The morning sun filtered through the glass panels of the Grandview Tropical Conservatory, casting prismatic shadows across the lush landscape within. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles as she made her way through the entrance, accompanied by her nephew Raymond, who had insisted on bringing her to see the newly opened Christmas exhibition. The conservatory, located just outside the charming seaside town of Whitmore Bay, had become a point of considerable pride for the community, and this year's holiday display promised to be the most spectacular yet. The entrance hall was festooned with garland and twinkling lights, creating an atmosphere that blended the natural world with festive cheer. Poinsettias in crimson and ivory arranged themselves beside traditional Christmas trees, their branches adorned with ornaments shaped like various species of wildlife. At the centre of the grand foyer stood an enormous banner proclaiming the Christmas Butterfly Exhibition, a celebration of nature's most delicate wonders. Raymond, a man in his early 40s with his aunt's sharp eyes, paused to consult his programme. "You know, Aunt Jane, I read that this exhibition marks the conservatory's 10th anniversary. They've brought in butterflies from conservation programmes around the world. It's supposed to be quite the achievement in the field of entomology and preservation." Miss Marple smiled gently. "How lovely. There's something rather poetic about butterflies at Christmas, don't you think? They represent transformation and beauty, which seems fitting for the season. Though I must confess, I find the study of living creatures endlessly fascinating. People often reveal themselves through how they treat those dependent upon them." They proceeded deeper into the conservatory, entering the main exhibition hall where the air grew warm and humid. The temperature had been carefully controlled to mimic the tropical climates from which the butterflies hailed. Flowering plants in shades of coral, magenta, and gold bloomed around them, their nectar attracting hundreds of delicate winged visitors. The sight was indeed breathtaking, a riot of colour and movement that seemed almost otherworldly. It was there they encountered their first guide, a young man of perhaps 30, with an eager demeanour and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was still acclimating to his position. His name tag identified him as James Potter, assistant curator. He greeted them with visible enthusiasm, launching into an explanation about the various species on display. "We have representatives from every major butterfly family," he explained, gesturing toward a display of monarchs clustered on a flowering plant. "These specimens come from our partnerships with conservation organisations. Each butterfly here represents a success story in our efforts to protect endangered species and educate the public about the importance of biodiversity." Miss Marple observed him thoughtfully as he spoke. There was something beneath his cheerfulness that suggested concern, a tightness around his eyes that contradicted his warm smile. She had spent many years reading the subtle languages of expression and bearing, and this young man, she sensed, carried some burden beyond his official duties. "Where is your curator today, Mr. Potter?" she asked pleasantly. "I was hoping to pay my respects and perhaps compliment them on this remarkable exhibition." James Potter's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Ah, well, that would be Dr. Marcus Thorne. He's in his office at the moment, preparing for the official opening ceremony tonight. He doesn't always guide visitors personally. He tends to be quite absorbed in the administrative side of things. Though I must say, this exhibition represents several years of his work to bring it together." "How impressive," said Miss Marple. "A man devoted to his work. I do so admire dedication, though sometimes such absorption can lead one toward questionable decisions." Raymond cast his aunt a slightly curious glance, wondering what she meant by her remark. But James Potter had already launched into another explanation about the conservation efforts, and they moved deeper into the exhibition hall. The main chamber of the conservatory was an architectural marvel, its glass ceiling rising nearly 4 stories above them. The space had been divided into several ecological zones, each representing a different climate where butterflies thrived. The tropical zone featured dense vegetation and cascading water features. The meadow zone displayed native wildflowers, while a third section attempted to recreate the misty cloud forests of Central and South America. As they wandered through the exhibition, Miss Marple took careful note of the other visitors. There was a group of schoolchildren, supervised by what appeared to be teachers and volunteers. There were several tourists armed with cameras and guidebooks, and there were 2 individuals who stood somewhat apart from the general flow of visitors. A woman in her early 50s, dressed with the kind of casual elegance that suggested both education and substantial financial resources, and a man roughly the same age, wearing the practical clothing of someone accustomed to field work, his weathered face suggesting countless hours in outdoor environments. The woman appeared to be speaking earnestly with James Potter at one point, her expression serious, while the man maintained a deliberate distance, observing the collection with what seemed like intense scrutiny rather than casual interest. "Mr. Potter," Miss Marple called out gently, "when is Dr. Thorne expected to make an appearance? I should very much like to offer my congratulations on this extraordinary undertaking." James Potter consulted his watch. He should be joining us within the hour for a preliminary walkthrough before the evening ceremony. If you'd like to wait in our visitor centre, we have excellent refreshments. Raymond, I'm sure you'd enjoy our cafe. There's a wonderful view of the gardens from there. They accepted his offer gratefully, making their way to the visitor centre, a modern building connected to the conservatory proper by a glass corridor. As they settled with tea and pastries, Miss Marple found herself contemplating what she'd observed. The tension she'd sensed in James Potter's demeanour, the serious conversation between the woman and the assistant curator, the watchful presence of the man observing the collection with such intensity. These were threads, barely noticeable to the casual observer, but threads nonetheless. About 30 minutes later, as they were preparing to return to the main conservatory for the official opening ceremonies, Miss Marple observed a commotion near the entrance. A man emerged from the corridor leading to the conservatory proper, walking with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He was perhaps 55 years old, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, dressed impeccably in a designer suit that seemed slightly incongruous in an institution dedicated to wildlife. This, she surmised, was Dr. Marcus Thorne. He was accompanied by several staff members, and his manner was cordial enough, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of something less pleasant beneath the surface. He spoke to those around him with the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and there was something in the way he glanced at the butterfly displays that suggested assessment rather than appreciation. "Raymond, shall we return to the main exhibition for the ceremony?" Miss Marple suggested. "I believe we're about to witness something rather significant unfold." As evening descended, and the official opening ceremony approached, the Grandview Tropical Conservatory seemed to pulse with anticipation. Visitors and staff gathered in the central chamber as the sun outside began its descent toward the horizon, casting golden light through the glass panels above. Garland had been strung between the support structures, and small white lights twinkled like captured stars. Dr. Marcus Thorne took his position on a small platform that had been erected for the occasion, and as Miss Marple watched from her vantage point beside Raymond, she found herself struck by something she couldn't quite define. It was the manner in which the woman she'd observed earlier stood apart from the crowd, watching Dr. Thorne with an expression of such intensity that it seemed almost tangible. And the man in fieldwork clothing had positioned himself with a clear view of the curator's face, his jaw set firm. Whatever was happening in this place, Miss Marple reflected, as Thorne began his speech about the importance of conservation and the miracle of natural beauty, it was certainly more complex than a simple holiday exhibition celebration. Chapter 2. The Sting of Discovery. 3 days later, the Christmas exhibition had settled into its regular rhythm. Visitors came and went in pleasant waves throughout the day, enjoying the warmth and exotic beauty of the conservatory environment. The evening hours, however, were reserved for private viewing by donors and conservation specialists. It was during one such exclusive evening that the evening's festivities took a dramatically darker turn. Miss Marple had accepted an invitation from Raymond to attend the opening gala reception, an event that promised to showcase the Conservatory's most generous patrons and supporters. She had dressed carefully in one of her better evening dresses, a deep green that she felt was both appropriate for the occasion and flattering for her years. Raymond had arranged for a car to bring them to Whitmore Bay, and they arrived at the Conservatory at precisely 7 o'clock. The main exhibition hall had been transformed with the addition of elegant tables, a catering station, and a small orchestral ensemble playing tasteful classical music. The staff had outdone themselves in creating an atmosphere of refined celebration, though to Miss Marple's discerning eye there remained an undercurrent of something less than genuine warmth among those working to maintain the event's facade of success. She observed James Potter moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency, ensuring that guests were welcomed and attended to appropriately. The young assistant curator appeared even more strained than he had during their initial encounter, his smile fixed in place, his eyes frequently darting toward the office area where Dr. Thorne could be seen, in conversation with several affluent-looking individuals. The woman whom Miss Marple had noticed on the first day was present at the gala as well, though now she wore a formal evening dress of modest elegance. She was introduced to Miss Marple by James Potter as Dr. Helena Winters, the Chief Conservation Officer for the Regional Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Winters extended her hand graciously, and when she smiled, Miss Marple detected both intelligence and sorrow in that gesture. "It's lovely to meet you, Miss Marple," Dr. Winters said warmly. "Your nephew mentioned that you have a keen interest in understanding human nature. I find that skill invaluable in my line of work." Miss Marple accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. "I find that understanding people requires little more than careful observation, my dear. And patience, of course. People reveal themselves far more readily than they imagine, particularly when they believe no one is watching closely." Dr. Winter's expression grew more serious for a moment. "That's remarkably astute. There are certain matters at this conservatory that I wish I could observe more clearly. Shall we say that not everything here is quite as it appears on the surface?" Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the centre of the exhibition hall drew their attention. A tall man with weathered features had approached Dr. Thorne and was speaking to him with visible agitation. This, Miss Marple correctly deduced, was the man she'd observed on their first visit. His voice carried across the hall with surprising clarity, despite his efforts to keep the conversation private. "You can't continue this charade, Thorne. The species you've been collecting are endangered for a reason. Each butterfly you remove from the wild represents a significant loss to already fragile ecosystems." The man's face had flushed with anger. Dr. Thorne responded calmly, his voice carrying a tone of dismissal. "My dear Gareth, conservation is a business like any other. We do what we must to fund our operations and keep this institution running. Without private donations and exclusive acquisitions, this conservatory would have closed years ago." The man, apparently named Gareth, appeared as though he might respond further, but Dr. Winters moved gracefully toward the two men, her professional demeanour masking whatever personal feelings she might have harboured toward them. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should take this discussion to a more private setting," she suggested, though her tone made it clear it was not truly a suggestion. As Dr. Winters diplomatically redirected both men away from the crowd, Miss Marple turned to James Potter, who had positioned himself nearby. She suspected the young man might possess insights into the tensions she was beginning to perceive. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "that gentleman seemed quite upset with Dr. Thorne. I'm curious whether such disagreements are common within the conservatory's operations." James Potter glanced nervously in the direction the men had gone. "The gentleman you just observed is Gareth Ashford, one of our research scientists. He has, as of late, become increasingly concerned about certain aspects of Dr. Thorne's curatorial practices. The rest of us prefer not to involve ourselves in such disputes. Yet you yourself seem troubled by something," Miss Marple observed with gentle directness. "Perhaps you might find it helps to speak of one's concerns. I find that many burdens seem lighter when shared with someone who listens without judgment." James Potter appeared to be warring with himself, clearly wanting to confide, but uncertain whether doing so was wise. Before he could make a decision, however, a horrifying scream split the elegant atmosphere of the gala. The scream had come from the private conservatory office area, and immediately the festive atmosphere dissolved into chaos. Guests surged toward the sound while staff members rushed in that direction. Miss Marple, exercising the good sense that had served her so well over decades of encountering human tragedy, remained where she stood and directed Raymond to do the same, though she positioned them with a clear view of what would unfold. Within moments, Dr. Winters emerged from the office area, her face pale beneath her composed exterior. She raised her hand for attention, and the crowd gradually quieted, recognizing the authority in her gesture. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident," she announced, her voice steady despite the situation. "Please remain calm and do not attempt to enter the office area. Dr. Thorne has suffered a serious medical event. We're calling emergency services immediately." But even as she spoke these measured words, Miss Marple observed the expression in Dr. Winters's eyes, and it was not one of surprise or shock. It was something far more complex, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and perhaps a hint of grim satisfaction. The emergency response was swift and efficient. Paramedics arrived within minutes, and they quickly made their way to Dr. Thorne. But when they emerged, their expressions made clear what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect. Dr. Marcus Thorne would not be recovering from whatever had occurred in his office. The paramedics conferred briefly with a man who was introduced as Inspector Willoughby, the local police official who had been summoned to the scene. As Raymond quietly explained to his aunt that they should probably make their departure, Miss Marple remained thoughtfully observant, watching the subtle interactions between the various people present. She noted that James Potter appeared devastated but not entirely shocked. Gareth Ashford stood apart from the others, his expression unreadable. Dr. Winters was providing assistance to the inspector, her professional composure intact, and among the other patrons, a few maintained appropriate expressions of distress, while others seemed to be calculating something beyond their immediate concern for the curator's fate. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple caught a fragment of conversation between Inspector Willoughby and Dr. Winters. The inspector was asking what they'd found in the office. "It appears he was stung by a butterfly," Dr. Winters replied, her voice low. "Specifically one that shouldn't exist in our collection. The species is the Heliconia sara, a butterfly rarely found outside specific cloud forest regions. More significantly, it carries a venom that can cause severe allergic reactions in humans. Dr. Thorne appears to have been severely allergic. But that species isn't in our collection," James Potter interjected, having overheard the conversation. "We would never intentionally include a dangerous species in our exhibition." "Precisely," said Inspector Willoughby grimly, "which raises the question of how such a butterfly came to be in Dr. Thorne's office in the first place, and whether its presence there was entirely accidental." Chapter 3. The Investigator's Question. The morning following Dr. Thorne's death brought a flurry of activity to the Grandview Tropical Conservatory that bore no resemblance to the festive exhibition of the previous days. Police vehicles lined the parking area, and uniformed officers could be seen restricting access to certain areas of the building. The media had descended upon Whitmore Bay with the insatiable hunger of journalists, sensing a significant story, and already the narrative was beginning to form in public consciousness. Curator dies from mysterious butterfly sting in suspected accident. Inspector Willoughby, however, was not convinced it was an accident, and it was this conviction that led him to seek out Miss Jane Marple. He had been informed by a colleague that the elderly woman visiting the conservatory on the day before the curator's death possessed a remarkable track record of solving mysteries, and after reviewing her background, he had decided that her insight might prove invaluable to his investigation. Miss Marple was taking her morning tea at the Whitmore Bay Inn, where she and Raymond had taken rooms for their extended visit, when the inspector was announced. She received him with the gracious courtesy she extended to all visitors, though her keen blue eyes assessed him as carefully as his official position and bearing might suggest. "Inspector Willoughby," she said warmly, "it's kind of you to visit. I confess I was expecting you. When a death occurs under unusual circumstances, I find that those who have observed the victim and those surrounding him invariably become persons of interest to law enforcement." The inspector, a man in his early 50s, with the measured demeanour of one long accustomed to investigating human failings, settled into the chair opposite Miss Marple with visible respect for her perception. "I've been informed that you possess considerable experience in matters of this nature, Miss Marple. I wonder if you might share your observations regarding Dr. Thorne and those with whom he interacted during your visit to the conservatory." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Before I share any observations, Inspector, I believe it would be helpful if you told me what you've discovered about the circumstances of Dr. Thorne's death. I find that understanding the facts as gathered by official investigation provides necessary context for one's own impressions." Inspector Willoughby consulted his notebook. "Doctor, Thorne died from anaphylactic shock brought on by venom introduced into his system through what appears to be an insect sting. The insect in question is the Heliconius sara, a butterfly found primarily in cloud forest regions of South America. This species produces a venom that, while generally not life-threatening to humans, caused a severe allergic reaction in the curator. Medical examination suggests the reaction was unusually violent, though Dr. Thorne had no recorded history of butterfly sting allergies. The butterfly in question did not belong in our conservatory's collection, according to the official inventory." "How was the sting delivered, if I may ask?" Miss Marple inquired. "That is the crucial question that troubles me," the inspector replied. "Dr. Thorne was found in his office, slumped in his chair at his desk. The butterfly was discovered crushed on the surface of that same desk, as though it had been struck after delivering its sting. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no indication that Dr. Thorne had attempted to flee or defend himself. The window was closed, the door locked from the inside, though admittedly locked doors can be circumvented by those with access to keys. Miss Marple's expression suggested she was processing this information with great care. And who among the conservatory staff possessed access to Dr. Thorne's office? That's where the matter becomes complicated, Inspector Willoughby admitted. The office is accessible by key, but the locks at this institution are relatively unsophisticated. Several people had keys. James Potter, the assistant curator, Dr. Helena Winters, the conservation officer, the conservatory's facilities manager, the head of security, and the director of the board, who visited regularly. Additionally, Dr. Thorne's own key was discovered on his person, which suggests anyone with access to the master key system could have entered. And there is no one who can definitively establish their whereabouts during the time of death, Miss Marple suggested. "Precisely," the inspector confirmed. The gala was in full progress, which created sufficient confusion and movement that ascertaining exact positions at any given moment has proven difficult. Several staff members claim to have been attending to guest needs. Dr. Winters was observed in various locations throughout the reception. James Potter similarly was involved with catering and guest management. Gareth Ashford, the research scientist, was present throughout the gala, though no one specifically recalls speaking with him during the crucial period. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, her gaze settling on the distant view of the conservatory building. "Tell me, Inspector, what was Dr. Thorne's reputation among his staff and within the wider conservation community? I find that murders, when they are indeed murders and not accidents, generally emerge from profound emotional provocation or significant material interest." Inspector Willoughby hesitated, as though uncertain how much to reveal. "However, my preliminary investigation has uncovered some troubling information. Dr. Thorne appears to have been engaged in acquiring rare and endangered butterflies through sources that skirt the edges of legality, if not cross them entirely. Several specimens in the conservatory's collection appear to have been obtained through private collectors, rather than through established conservation channels. Furthermore, there are indications that he was selling specimens to wealthy collectors, and that these sales may have contributed to the decline of certain endangered species. So, Dr. Thorne was, in essence, a smuggler," Miss Marple observed quietly. "A man profiting from the extinction of species he was supposed to be protecting. I suspect this would have created enemies, both among those who profit from his illegal activities and those committed to genuine conservation." "Indeed," the inspector agreed, "which is why I'm here seeking your perspective. You observed these people in their natural habitat, so to speak, before the death occurred. What impressions did you form of them?" Miss Marple returned to her seat and resumed her tea, which had grown tepid during her conversation with the inspector. She took a sip, set down the cup, and gathered her thoughts with the care she brought to all significant matters. Dr. Helena Winters is a woman of principle who is deeply troubled by something she perceives as a betrayal of conservation ideals, I observed. Her interest in the conservatory's operations appears driven by professional concern, rather than personal animosity, yet that professional concern carries considerable emotional weight for her. Gareth Ashford, the research scientist, is a man consumed by righteous anger regarding endangered species protection. He confronted Dr. Thorne at the gala with visible emotional intensity. Such anger, when directed at someone involved in environmental destruction, can motivate remarkable actions. James Potter is a young man caught between professional loyalty and personal ethics. He clearly disapproves of Dr. Thorne's practices, yet he remains employed at the conservatory, which suggests either financial necessity or a degree of complicity that troubles his conscience. And yet, Miss Marple continued, the most interesting question is not who might have wished Dr. Thorne dead, for I suspect that list is quite substantial. The question is rather, who had both the motive and the specific knowledge to select and introduce a butterfly whose venom would trigger exactly the kind of reaction that occurred. That suggests not merely anger or ideological opposition, but rather someone with considerable scientific knowledge, access to rare species, and the ability to predict the consequences of their actions. Inspector Willoughby leaned forward with visible interest. You're suggesting the murder was carefully planned rather than opportunistic. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple, replied, that someone who understood butterfly venom properties, who had access to a specimen of Heliconius sara, and who possessed both the knowledge and the ability to place it in Dr. Thorne's office, chose this method deliberately. The locked office is interesting, but far from insurmountable to someone with keys and the authority to move about the conservatory at will. The inspector rose to depart, his mind clearly turning toward the new investigative angles Miss Marple's observations had raised. Before leaving, he turned back to her. You've been most helpful, Miss Marple. I wonder if you might continue to observe developments at the conservatory. Your presence is likely to elicit candid responses from those involved in this matter. Miss Marple smiled with gentle amusement. I suspect, Inspector, that you and I both understand that I would do so regardless of your request. The threads of this mystery have caught my attention quite thoroughly. I shall be spending considerable time at the conservatory in coming days. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the morning light play across the distant landscape. She found herself thinking about the delicate complexity of butterfly ecosystems, the way that removing a single species could cascade through environmental networks in ways not always immediately apparent. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the current situation. Someone had removed Dr. Thorne from the human ecosystem of the conservatory, and the ripples of that removal were only beginning to spread. Chapter 4. The Conservatory's Secrets. 2 days after Dr. Thorne's death, the Grandview Tropical Conservatory had reopened its doors to the public, though the official exhibition remained closed pending the completion of the police investigation. Instead, visitors could enjoy the regular displays in the surrounding gardens, which continued to bloom with the generosity that even December could provide in this temperate coastal region. It was during one of these visiting days that Miss Marple returned to the conservatory, ostensibly to continue her observation of the butterfly collection, but in reality to conduct her own investigation into the various threads she had begun to perceive. She found James Potter in the visitor centre, looking far more haggard than he had during her previous visit. The young man appeared not to have slept well, and his usual eager demeanour had been replaced by a kind of numb compliance with his duties. When Miss Marple approached him with her gentle manner, he seemed almost grateful for the opportunity to speak with someone who appeared to view him with kindness rather than suspicion. "Mr. Potter, I hope you'll forgive me for intruding upon your time," Miss Marple began, "but I find myself quite troubled by Dr. Thorne's death, and I wonder if you might help me understand a few matters regarding the conservatory's operations." James Potter glanced around to ensure no other visitors or staff were within earshot before responding. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I must confess I'm uncertain what I might help clarify. The police have asked me numerous questions already." "I'm sure they have," Miss Marple replied gently. "However, police investigations tend to focus on the immediate circumstances of the crime, whereas I find myself more interested in understanding the character and relationships of those involved. Tell me, Mr. Potter, how long have you worked at the conservatory? Nearly 4 years, the young man replied. I began as an intern while I was completing my studies in conservation biology. Dr. Thorne impressed me initially as a visionary conservationist, a man truly dedicated to species preservation and environmental education. But your perception of him changed, Miss Marple observed, noting the past tense in his remarks. James Potter's shoulders slumped slightly. Over the past 18 months, yes. I began to notice discrepancies in our inventory systems. Butterflies that should have been in certain enclosures were missing. Dr. Thorne would explain their absence as transfers to other institutions or natural deaths, but the explanations never quite aligned with the official records. Did you confront him about these discrepancies? She asked. I tried to raise my concerns with Dr. Winters, the conservation officer. I didn't feel comfortable accusing Dr. Thorne directly, but I mentioned that I'd noticed some inconsistencies. Dr. Winters took my concerns quite seriously, I think. She began conducting her own investigation into the conservatory's acquisition and disposition practices. And what did she discover? Miss Marple asked. I'm not entirely certain, but I believe she uncovered evidence that Dr. Thorne had been acquiring endangered species through illegal channels and selling them to private collectors. When she attempted to confront him about this matter, he reportedly became quite aggressive, suggesting that if she pursued the matter further, he would ensure her professional reputation was destroyed. He had connections, you see, in both the legitimate conservation world and in less legitimate circles. He could have made her accusations seem like professional jealousy or malice. Did Dr. Winters seem frightened by this threat? Miss Marple inquired. Somewhat, yes, though she also seemed determined. She contacted the Environmental Protection Agency's legal division and began building a case against Dr. Thorne for illegal species trafficking. There was talk of formal charges being filed, but it was all proceeding slowly through bureaucratic channels, and Gareth Ashford, the research scientist. What is your understanding of his relationship with Dr. Thorne? She asked. James Potter's expression grew troubled. Gareth is a brilliant scientist, but he's also quite idealistic about conservation. He discovered that several butterfly species in our collection had been taken from wild populations in ways that violated international protection treaties. He was particularly concerned about a rare Heliconius species that had apparently been acquired from a collector in Brazil, a purchase that would have required importing an illegally obtained specimen. The Heliconius sara, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested. James Potter nodded slowly. Yes, actually. How did you know that? I have my sources of information, Miss Marple replied cryptically. Tell me, was this particular species known to possess venomous properties? James Potter appeared surprised by the question. Yes, actually. The Heliconius sara is one of the few butterfly species that produces venom. The venom is delivered through specialized spines on their wings. It's not considered dangerous to humans in most circumstances, but some people have severe allergic reactions to the venom proteins. Had Dr. Thorne ever expressed any concern about his potential allergies to butterfly stings? Miss Marple asked. Not to my knowledge, James Potter replied, though now that you mention it, I recall Dr. Winters asking him a similar question. He dismissed the inquiry, suggesting that people in his position had to take certain occupational risks. Miss Marple thanked James Potter for his candour and made her way deeper into the conservatory, her mind organising the information she had gathered. She had requested that Inspector Willoughby examine whether Dr. Thorne had any known allergies, and his report had indicated no documented history of serious allergic reactions. Yet this made the manner of his death all the more suspicious. Someone with knowledge of his physical constitution would have known whether introducing butterfly venom would trigger a fatal reaction. She found Dr. Helena Winters in the conservatory's administrative office, reviewing documents with a member of the board. When Winters saw Miss Marple, she excused herself and invited the older woman to join her in a quieter space, a small office that appeared to be Winters's temporary workspace during the investigation. Miss Marple, I'm glad you've returned, Dr. Winters said, closing the office door behind them. I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you further. I sense that you understand more about this situation than most people realize. Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair with the deliberate movements of her years. I understand, Dr. Winters, that you've been conducting your own investigation into Dr. Thorne's activities regarding endangered species. I further understand that you are prepared to bring formal charges against him for illegal trafficking. Dr. Winters's expression grew cautious. That information hasn't been made public. How did you... I have made inquiries, Miss Marple replied simply. I find that in matters of murder, the most significant motivations often lie in professional or financial stakes. Tell me, Dr. Winters, as someone dedicated to conservation and environmental protection, how did you manage to work with someone whose actions were causing extinction? Winters rose and moved to the window of her temporary office, gazing out at the butterfly garden beyond. It was increasingly difficult, she admitted. Every time I discovered another species that had been illegally acquired and sold to private collectors, it felt like a personal failure. Species that might have been saved through legitimate conservation efforts were instead lost because of Dr. Thorne's greed. Did you consider him beyond redemption? Miss Marple asked gently. Winters turned back to face her. By the end, yes. He had become an obstacle to genuine conservation work, a man whose actions undermined everything we're trying to accomplish in species protection. He would have continued his illegal activities indefinitely, and each butterfly species he trafficked in represented countless individual animals that would never exist because their wild populations were decimated. You were prepared to destroy his career and see him prosecuted, Miss Marple observed. Yes, Winters admitted, though I preferred to see the legal process handle the matter rather than take justice into my own hands, as the cliché suggests. Yet you possess substantial knowledge of butterfly species, their venom properties, and the means to acquire dangerous specimens, Miss Marple noted. I do, Winters agreed, though I suspect you're not accusing me of Dr. Thorne's murder so much as establishing whether I possess the capability to commit it. The answer is yes. I could have obtained the Heliconia Sara. I could have introduced it to his office, and given my research into his allergies, I might have suspected the venom would trigger a fatal reaction. But I didn't commit the murder, Miss Marple. Regardless of how much I might have desired to see Dr. Thorne stopped, I wouldn't kill him. Miss Marple studied the conservation officer carefully, employing the techniques she'd refined over decades of assessing human sincerity. There was truth in Winters's words, she believed, but not necessarily the whole truth. The woman was hiding something, though whether it related to the murder itself or merely to her own conduct was less clear. I believe you, Miss Marple said finally, though I suspect you know more about this situation than you've disclosed to Inspector Willoughby. Am I correct in this assessment? Winters hesitated for a long moment before responding. There are professional confidentialities involved, Miss Marple, information that came to me through official channels that I'm not at liberty to share. But I will say that there are multiple threads connecting various people in this conservatory, and Dr. Thorne's death may have resolved one problem, while revealing others far more significant. Miss Marple rose to depart. I appreciate your candour, Dr. Winters. I suspect we shall speak again before this matter reaches its conclusion. As she made her way through the conservatory's corridors, Miss Marple found herself in the butterfly exhibition area, surrounded once again by the delicate beauty of these remarkable creatures. She paused before a display of heliconius butterflies, watching them flutter among flowering plants. They were, she reflected, among nature's most beautiful creations, yet they carried within them a deadly secret, much as humans often carried secrets within their seemingly respectable exteriors. Chapter 5. The Scientist's Confession. The following morning brought a significant development in the investigation. Inspector Willoughby contacted Miss Marple with news that Gareth Ashford had requested a meeting with the police, indicating he possessed information relevant to the case. Miss Marple, invited to attend this meeting given her role as an informal consultant, arrived at the Whitmore Bay police station to find the research scientist in a state of considerable emotional distress. Gareth Ashford was a man in his early 50s, tall and weathered from years of fieldwork in tropical environments. His hands bore the marks of someone accustomed to careful scientific work, yet they trembled slightly as he sat across from Inspector Willoughby in an interview room. Miss Marple positioned herself quietly in a corner, where she could observe both the scientist and the inspector without being intrusive. "I need to tell you something," Ashford began, his voice rough with emotion. Something I should have revealed immediately after Dr. Thorne's death, but I was frightened and uncertain of the consequences. Inspector Willoughby leaned forward with practiced patience. "Take your time, Mr. Ashford. The truth, however difficult, is always preferable to uncertainty in a murder investigation." Gareth Ashford took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that Dr. Thorne had acquired a specimen of Heliconia sara through illegal channels. The species is protected under international law, and its acquisition and possession constitute serious crimes. More significantly, this particular specimen had been collected from a wild population in Ecuador, a population that is already critically endangered. The removal of even one individual represents a significant loss. "How did you discover this acquisition?" Inspector Willoughby asked. "I was reviewing our inventory system, looking into other irregularities I'd noticed, when I found documentation of the Heliconia sara's arrival. The paperwork claimed it came from a legitimate breeding facility, but I recognized the documentation as fraudulent. The breeding facility listed doesn't exist. I contacted them directly and confirmed this." "What did you do upon discovering this information?" the inspector asked. "I immediately confronted Dr. Thorne. I told him that I intended to report the illegal acquisition to Dr. Winters, and that I would be recommending that the specimen be transferred to a facility equipped to eventually release it back to its native habitat." Dr. Thorne responded with threats. He said that if I reported him, he would ensure I never found employment in any legitimate scientific institution again. He suggested that he had connections that would allow him to destroy my professional reputation and my career. "Yet, you persisted in your intention to report him," Miss Marple observed gently from her position in the room. Ashford glanced toward her, acknowledging her presence. "I did inform Dr. Winters of the situation. She was already building a case against Dr. Thorne for multiple violations of species protection laws. My discovery of the Heliconia sara specimen was additional evidence that would support her charges. And then, several days ago, I did something that I've regretted constantly since," Ashford continued. "I made a critical decision that I now believe may have influenced subsequent events. I attempted to remove the Heliconia sara specimen from the conservatory without official authorization. I intended to transport it to a research facility where it could be properly cared for and eventually repatriated to its native habitat." Inspector Willoughby's expression sharpened. "You removed an endangered butterfly specimen from the conservatory without authorization?" "Yes," Ashford admitted. "I knew I was breaking protocol and potentially violating laws regarding specimen possession, but I also believed that leaving the butterfly in Dr. Thorne's hands would be a far greater violation of conservation principles. I had obtained temporary authorization from contacts at the research facility, and I believed I was acting in the species' best interest." "How did you manage to remove the specimen, and where is it now?" the inspector asked. "I used my authority as a research scientist to access the specimen storage area. I carefully captured the butterfly using proper entomological techniques, placed it in a specialized container with appropriate food and environmental conditions, and transported it to the facility. It was released into a controlled environment where it's currently being studied and cared for." The inspector and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. This revelation cast the matter in a new light. If Gareth Ashford had removed the Heliconia sara specimen from the conservatory, then the butterfly that had killed Dr. Thorne could not have been the specimen Ashford had relocated. There was, instead, another Heliconia sara present in the conservatory, one that neither Ashford nor the official inventory acknowledged. "Mr. Ashford," Inspector Willoughby said slowly, "are you certain there was only one Heliconia sara specimen in the conservatory? Is it possible that Dr. Thorne possessed another such specimen?" Ashford's face paled. "I hadn't considered that possibility. I assumed the specimen I found was the only one, but if Dr. Thorne had acquired another Heliconia sara from elsewhere, that would explain how the butterfly that killed him came to be in his office." "When did you remove the specimen you relocated?" the inspector asked. 3 days before Dr. Thorne's death," Ashford replied. "So if there was another butterfly, it would have had to arrive at the conservatory after my removal of the first one." Inspector Willoughby made notes of this information. "Do you have any knowledge of Dr. Thorne acquiring additional specimens in the days before his death?" "No," Ashford said, "though he could have kept acquisitions secret from his staff. He had private suppliers and occasionally received items through channels that didn't pass through normal institutional procedures. After interviewing Ashford further and obtaining his signed statement, Inspector Willoughby and Miss Marple departed the police station. As they walked toward the inspector's car, Willoughby spoke his concerns aloud. So now we must determine who provided Dr. Thorne with a second Heliconia sara specimen, and whether that person was responsible for his death. The fact that Ashford removed the first specimen complicates matters considerably. If he'd left it in place, we would have had a clearer chain of causation. Yet, it also clarifies certain matters, Miss Marple observed. If Mr. Ashford removed the first specimen days before the murder, and another specimen was used in the death itself, then someone else deliberately obtained and delivered a deadly butterfly to Dr. Thorne's office. This suggests premeditation and specific knowledge. Not merely someone acting in anger, but someone planning a calculated act. Inspector, have you examined Dr. Thorne's personal correspondence and communications? Miss Marple asked. We have reviewed his email and phone records, the inspector replied. There are several communications from individuals within the butterfly and specimen trading community, but nothing that obviously points toward his killer. I wonder if you might examine those communications more closely for references to Heliconia sara specifically, Miss Marple suggested. Someone who arranged for the acquisition of such a specimen would likely have left some trace of communication regarding its arrival and handling. The inspector agreed to pursue this avenue of investigation, and Miss Marple requested to be kept informed of developments. As Raymond collected her from the police station, she reflected on the growing complexity of the case. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward, if unusual, murder was instead revealing itself to be far more intricate, involving multiple threads of deception, illegal activity, and competing motivations. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her hotel room and composed a detailed timeline of events on her writing pad, noting every fact, inference, and question mark that had emerged from her investigation thus far. By the time she finished, the light outside had faded to darkness, and the timeline covered 3 full pages. Yet one fact struck her as particularly significant. Someone had deliberately acquired and delivered a Heliconia sara to Dr. Thorne's office after Gareth Ashford had removed the original specimen from the Conservatory. This meant that the murderer not only wanted Dr. Thorne dead, but specifically wanted him dead by means of a butterfly sting. This was not a crime of passion or desperate circumstance. This was a crime conceived in deliberation and executed with specific purpose. Chapter 6. The Collector's Confession. 2 days later, Inspector Willoughby made a significant breakthrough in his investigation. A review of Dr. Thorne's email communications revealed a pattern of messages between him and an individual identified only as VC, who appeared to be a high-end butterfly specimen collector. The exchanges referenced multiple acquisitions of rare and endangered species, specific pricing arrangements, and delivery instructions. Most relevantly, there were several recent emails discussing the procurement of Heliconia sara specimens, with specific references to a particularly prized individual obtained from Ecuador. The inspector traced the VC emails to an address in London and subsequently obtained warrants to investigate the identity of this collector. What he discovered was that VC stood for Victor Carmichael, a wealthy businessman who had amassed what was likely the world's largest private collection of rare butterflies. Carmichael, now in his 60s, had made his fortune in pharmaceuticals and had spent the last 2 decades acquiring specimens that were either unavailable to legitimate scientific institutions or that had been explicitly forbidden from private collection due to endangered species protections. Inspector Willoughby arranged for British authorities to contact Carmichael and request his cooperation in the investigation. When Carmichael learned that the inquiry involved Dr. Thorne's death, he voluntarily agreed to come to Whitmore Bay to provide a statement, seemingly understanding that his cooperation would be advantageous to his legal position. Victor Carmichael arrived at the Whitmore Bay police station on a grey afternoon, looking every bit the wealthy businessman he was. He was an elegantly dressed man with silver hair and an air of confident entitlement that suggested a lifetime of having his wishes accommodated. Inspector Willoughby conducted the interview with Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, as had become the pattern in this investigation. "Mr. Carmichael," the inspector began, "I understand you have made significant acquisitions of rare butterfly specimens from Dr. Marcus Thorne over the past several years." Carmichael nodded without apparent discomfort. "I'm a collector, Inspector. I've spent considerable time and money acquiring specimens that interest me from an aesthetic and scientific perspective. Dr. Thorne was one of several suppliers who could provide me with rare species that would otherwise be unavailable to private collectors. I must ask you directly," Inspector Willoughby said, "whether you were aware that many of these acquisitions violated international laws regarding endangered species protection." "I was aware that certain acquisitions existed in a legal grey area," Carmichael replied without hesitation. "However, my position has always been that private collectors often provide superior care and preservation conditions for rare specimens compared to less well-funded scientific institutions. The species in my collection are alive and thriving, better preserved than they would be in many alternative scenarios. This philosophy does not align with conservation principles," the inspector observed. "Perhaps not," Carmichael agreed. "But I'm not a conservationist, Inspector. I'm a collector. I preserve these specimens in my private facility with the best possible conditions. They are not degraded or harmed by my possession of them. In some respects, I provide a kind of backup preservation if wild populations are threatened." "Can you account for your whereabouts on the evening of Dr. Thorne's death?" Inspector Willoughby asked. "I was in London," Carmichael replied. "I have numerous witnesses who can confirm I attended a private auction house event that evening. My attendance was noted, and I made several purchases at the event. Inspector Willoughby had already verified this alibi, as it turned out, which meant that despite his apparent guilt in the illegal acquisition of specimens, Carmichael was not directly responsible for Dr. Thorne's death. However, before you conclude your inquiry," Carmichael continued, "I believe you should know about a communication I received from Dr. Thorne approximately 1 week before his death. He contacted me urgently requesting that I cease acquisitions from him. He stated that he was concluding his private dealing in specimens and that future acquisitions would have to cease. He seemed frightened when we spoke, and he mentioned that he was attempting to resolve some complications in his professional life that had become serious threats to his safety." "Did he elaborate on the nature of these complications?" the inspector asked. "Not specifically," Carmichael replied, "but he implied that his activities had attracted attention from law enforcement and from certain parties within the conservation community who were determined to bring charges against him. He suggested that he might need to secure his personal affairs and possibly relocate to avoid prosecution." "This is interesting information," Inspector Willoughby said. "It suggests that Dr. Thorne was aware of the legal jeopardy he faced regarding his illegal acquisition and sale of specimens." "Indeed," Carmichael agreed. "And it also suggests that someone may have been sufficiently motivated by his threatened exposure to act against him before he could either flee or face prosecution." After Carmichael departed, Inspector Willoughby and Miss Marple conferred in the inspector's office. The investigation had now produced a clearer picture of Dr. Thorne's final days. He had been engaged in illegal species trafficking, had been building toward exposure and prosecution, and had become frightened enough to attempt to sever his connections to his criminal activities. He had also, according to James Potter's observations, begun to hint at his desire to set matters right and make amends. "This suggests," Miss Marple observed, "that Dr. Thorne may have been planning to cooperate with the authorities. He may have been preparing to provide evidence against his suppliers and against the networks that distributed endangered species to wealthy collectors. This would have constituted a serious threat to multiple individuals involved in the illegal trade." "Precisely," the inspector agreed, "which expands our circle of suspects considerably. We're no longer looking exclusively at those with personal grudges against Dr. Thorne, but also at those whose criminal enterprises he threatened to expose. Yet we still must resolve the question of the Heliconia Sara," Miss Marple noted. "Who obtained the second specimen, and how did it arrive in Dr. Thorne's office on the evening of his death?" Inspector Willoughby acknowledged the persistence of this fundamental question. "I have assigned officers to investigate all known suppliers of endangered butterfly specimens in the region. Eventually we should be able to trace the source of the deadly butterfly. In the meantime, I would appreciate if you continued your observations and inquiries among the conservatory staff. There is often a truth that reveals itself in personal interactions that eludes formal investigation." Miss Marple agreed to continue her work, and that evening she returned to the Grandview Tropical Conservatory, where evening hours had been made available to those wishing to continue viewing the permanent collections, while the formal exhibition remained closed, pending the completion of the investigation. The conservatory was nearly empty this late in the evening, with only a handful of visitors walking through the various ecological zones. Miss Marple made her way to the areas where the most delicate specimens were housed, observing the intricate beauty of the butterflies illuminated by carefully designed lighting systems. It was in the quiet solitude of the conservatory that she encountered Gareth Ashford examining specimens in one of the research areas. He appeared to be cataloguing information, his scientific demeanour suggesting careful work. When he noticed Miss Marple, he acknowledged her with a weary smile. "You seem to spend considerable time here," Miss Marple observed, joining him in the research area. "I'm attempting to restore order to the inventory systems," Ashford replied, "and to ensure that all remaining specimens are properly documented and secured. After what happened to Dr. Thorne, I want to ensure there are no further opportunities for dangerous or protected species to be mishandled." "You were quite brave to remove the first Heliconia Sara specimen," Miss Marple observed. "Even knowing the legal consequences you might face, you chose to act on your conservation principles." Ashford's expression grew complicated. "I did what I believed was right, though I'm aware my actions may have inadvertently influenced subsequent events. If I had left the specimen in place, perhaps the situation would have unfolded differently. Perhaps whoever obtained the second specimen would never have felt the need to do so." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Do you have theories regarding who obtained the second Heliconia Sara?" "I have suspicions," Ashford admitted, "but nothing concrete enough to share with Inspector Willoughby. There are certain elements of the species trafficking community that operate with remarkable discretion and efficiency. It would be entirely possible for someone determined to acquire a dangerous specimen to do so within days, if they possessed the proper connections." "And would someone within the conservatory staff possess such connections?" Miss Marple asked carefully. Ashford hesitated. "I shouldn't speculate about my colleagues," he said finally. "Yet you are speculating," Miss Marple observed gently, "and your speculation stems from knowledge you possess regarding someone's involvement in aspects of Dr. Thorne's criminal activities. I wonder if you might share that speculation with me, even if not with the police. I find that information shared in confidence often illuminates matters far more effectively than formal statements." Ashford wrestled with this proposition for a long moment before responding. "There is someone at the conservatory who I suspect of assisting Dr. Thorne in certain acquisitions. This person has access to specimen acquisition networks and the technical knowledge to handle dangerous species. However, I have no proof, and I'm uncertain whether their involvement extended to Dr. Thorne's death itself." Miss Marple waited patiently for him to continue, recognizing that the scientist was working through ethical considerations in deciding what to reveal. "I suspect Dr. Helena Winters may know more than she has disclosed to the authorities," Ashford said finally. "I don't believe she was involved in Dr. Thorne's death, but I believe she knows who was, or at least she has significant information that bears on the matter. However, her professional confidentiality obligations and her personal loyalty to certain individuals may be preventing her from coming forward." "These are serious accusations," Miss Marple observed. "They are observations, not accusations," Ashford corrected. "Observations based on limited information and personal suspicions rather than concrete evidence." After her conversation with Ashford, Miss Marple spent additional time in the conservatory, watching the evening visitors depart and the staff members prepare the facility for closure. She found herself drawn once again to the display of heliconius butterflies, these remarkable creatures that had become so significant to the unfolding mystery. As she watched them flutter among the flowering plants, she found herself contemplating the theme that had begun. To emerge from this investigation, multiple people possessed knowledge, capability, and motivation to kill Dr. Thorne. Multiple threads connected various individuals to the conservatory's criminal activities, and yet the actual murder had been committed by a single person, someone who had made a deliberate choice to introduce a deadly butterfly to the curator's office and to wait for the inevitable consequences. The question that Miss Marple now found herself contemplating was not merely who had killed Dr. Thorne, but why someone would choose such an elaborate and unusual method. Poison could have been administered easily. A physical attack could have been staged. Yet someone had specifically chosen to use a butterfly sting, a method requiring considerable planning and knowledge. This choice suggested something beyond mere killing. It suggested, to Miss Marple's experienced perception, a message. The murderer had chosen this method deliberately, choosing a butterfly that represented the very threats Dr. Thorne had been making to endangered species. This was not a crime of convenience or desperation. This was a crime of symbolic meaning, and with that recognition, certain pieces of the puzzle began to align in Miss Marple's mind, creating a pattern that suggested the direction her final investigations should take. Chapter 7. The Gardener's Secret. The conservatory's grounds extended considerably beyond the main glass structures, encompassing several acres of cultivated gardens that displayed the same commitment to beauty and scientific precision that characterized the indoor collections. These gardens featured native plants, butterfly-attracting flowering species, and carefully constructed habitats designed to support local wildlife populations. It was in this context that Miss Marple discovered the existence of a person whose role in the conservatory's operations had thus far received remarkably little attention from the police investigation. The head gardener of the Grandview Tropical Conservatory was a woman named Margaret Aldridge, a person in her early 60s who had worked at the institution since its founding 16 years previously. Margaret had, by all accounts, been an exemplary employee, dedicated to her work, unfailingly professional, and deeply committed to the conservation principles that ostensibly guided the institution's mission. Yet when Miss Marple began making inquiries about Margaret's background and her interactions with Dr. Thorne, she discovered that very little was actually known about this woman's personal history or motivations. Miss Marple's opportunity to speak directly with Margaret came when she deliberately scheduled a visit to the conservatory during the gardener's afternoon shift. She found Margaret working in the butterfly garden, carefully tending to the plants that provided nectar and sustenance for the delicate insects they attracted. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle manner, introducing herself and expressing interest in Margaret's extensive knowledge of butterfly-supporting plants. Margaret, initially reserved, gradually became more conversational as the conversation progressed, and Miss Marple's genuine interest in both botanical and conservation matters seemed to create a degree of common understanding between them. "You have clearly devoted considerable time and effort to creating these gardens," Miss Marple observed. "The results are truly remarkable." Margaret's expression softened. "I've always believed that if we're going to keep butterflies in captivity, we should at least provide them with environments that approximate their natural habitats as closely as possible." Dr. Thorne understood this principle initially, though his understanding became somewhat distorted over the years. "How so?" Miss Marple asked, settling onto a nearby bench to better engage in conversation. Margaret paused in her work and leaned against her gardening tools. When Dr. Thorne first arrived at the conservatory, he was genuinely committed to conservation. He understood that butterflies were not merely objects to be acquired and displayed, but living creatures dependent on complex ecological relationships. Over time, however, his focus shifted from conservation to collection. He began treating specimens like trophies, acquiring the rarest and most exotic species, regardless of the impact on wild populations or the legality of the acquisitions. "Did this change in perspective trouble you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Deeply," Margaret replied. "I grew increasingly uncomfortable with what I was observing, but I was also afraid. Dr. Thorne was the director of the institution. Challenging his decisions or his methods felt like challenging the fundamental purpose of my employment. I remained silent, which I suspect makes me complicit in his crimes." Miss Marple noted the depth of guilt reflected in Margaret's words and manner. "There is something more," she observed, "something beyond professional concern regarding Dr. Thorne's activities." Margaret set down her tools and sank onto the bench beside Miss Marple. "Yes," she admitted after a long pause, "there is something more. Something I haven't disclosed to the police, though I suspect I should have." She took a breath before continuing. "Years ago, before I came to work at the conservatory, I was involved in a relationship with a man who was deeply committed to conservation and environmental protection. We shared a passion for butterfly species in particular. We planned to marry and establish our own research facility focused on protecting endangered species. However, my partner was killed in an accident while conducting field work in a tropical region. He was working in an area where illegal butterfly poaching was occurring, and there was some suggestion that his death was not entirely accidental. Miss Marple listened with deep attention as Margaret continued to reveal her history. The loss of her partner had been devastating, and, in grief, Margaret had thrown herself into conservation work as a means of honouring his memory and continuing the work they had planned to undertake together. She had eventually found employment at the Grandview Tropical Conservatory, hoping to dedicate her skills to legitimate conservation efforts. Yet I discovered that the institution I was serving was itself engaged in the kind of illegal species acquisition and trafficking that I believed had contributed to my partner's death, Margaret said, her voice heavy with anguish. When I realised what Dr. Thorne was doing, it felt as though I was betraying my partner's memory simply by remaining silent. And yet, I remained silent nonetheless, paralysed by fear and uncertainty. Miss Marple observed that Margaret's grief, while seemingly resolved on the surface, had never fully processed the trauma of her loss, and she recognised that this unresolved grief might have motivated extraordinary actions, particularly if an opportunity had presented itself to address the source of the loss that had defined Margaret's life for so many years. "Did you ever discuss your concerns regarding Dr. Thorne's activities with others?" Miss Marple asked. "I mentioned my concerns to Dr. Helena Winters on several occasions," Margaret replied. She was sympathetic and shared my sense that Dr. Thorne's activities were deeply troubling. She was working to build a case against him, gathering evidence of his illegal acquisitions and his sales to private collectors. "And did Dr. Winters share information with you regarding her investigation?" Miss Marple asked. "Some," Margaret admitted. She knew that I had botanical expertise and that I was involved with the specimen acquisition process from the perspective of providing appropriate habitats. She asked me questions about certain acquisitions and whether I had observed any species arriving that seemed questionable or potentially dangerous, such as the Heliconia sara, Miss Marple suggested. Margaret's face became very still. "How did you know about that?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple proceeded carefully, not wishing to seem accusatory, but needing to understand Margaret's knowledge and involvement. "I have become familiar with the details of this investigation through my conversations with Inspector Willoughby and my observations of those connected to the conservatory. The Heliconia sara is significant because a specimen of this species was used in Dr. Thorne's death." "I know," Margaret said after a long silence. "I know because I acquired it." Chapter 8. The Poisoned Path. The confession that Margaret Aldridge offered to Miss Marple in the butterfly gardens of the Grandview Tropical Conservatory was delivered with the weary tone of someone finally releasing a burden they had carried far too long. Miss Marple listened without judgment or interruption, allowing Margaret to speak at her own pace, recognising that the act of confession itself was often as important as the content being confessed. "Dr. Winters approached me several weeks before Dr. Thorne's death," Margaret explained. She had become increasingly convinced that the only way to truly stop Dr. Thorne's activities was to prevent him from continuing his smuggling operations. She knew that legal proceedings would be slow, that Dr. Thorne had connections that might allow him to evade serious consequences, and that even if he was eventually prosecuted, it would take months or years to complete the process. In the interim, more endangered species would be trafficked, more wild populations would be decimated. Miss Marple noted that Margaret was describing events that implicated Dr. Winters in the planning of what appeared to have been Dr. Thorne's murder. She chose to ask a clarifying question rather than directly accuse. "What specifically did Dr. Winters ask of you, Margaret?" "She asked me to acquire a Heliconia sara specimen through certain channels that she knew were available to me," Margaret replied. She explained that the species possessed venom that could trigger severe allergic reactions in some humans. She asked me to research whether Dr. Thorne might possess a vulnerability to such venom, and she asked me to consider whether I would be willing to place such a specimen in a position where it could deliver a fatal sting to the man who had dedicated his life to destroying the very ecosystems that my deceased partner had sought to protect. Miss Marple felt a chill run through her at the clarity of Margaret's description. Dr. Winters had, it appeared, deliberately planned Dr. Thorne's death and had recruited Margaret as an accomplice to that plan. Yet there remained questions regarding how Margaret had actually proceeded and whether she truly had delivered the fatal butterfly. "Did you research Dr. Thorne's potential allergies?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Dr. Winters provided me with contact information for a private investigator who specialised in background research. Through this investigator, I discovered that Dr. Thorne had undergone allergy testing several years previously, and that the test results were available through a medical database that could be accessed by those with proper credentials. The results indicated that Dr. Thorne had never been tested for butterfly venom allergies specifically, but he did have documented sensitivities to insect venom proteins. The investigator suggested that such sensitivities often correlate with serious reactions to butterfly venom, particularly in species that produce unusually potent toxins. And you obtained a Heliconia sara specimen through Dr. Winters's channels," Miss Marple said. "I did," Margaret confirmed. "The specimen was obtained from a private collector in South America through a network that I was surprised to discover existed among certain conservation scientists. These individuals, operating outside official channels, have developed methods of acquiring endangered specimens specifically to remove them from circulation or to prevent them from falling into the hands of poachers or private collectors. The specimen I acquired was obtained from a facility in Ecuador where it was being maintained in captivity, awaiting eventual release back to the wild." "So the specimen itself came from a conservation effort," Miss Marple observed. "Yes," Margaret said. The irony was not lost on me. "We used a species that should have been protected and preserved to kill a man who was supposedly devoted to conservation, but was instead destroying it. There was a certain poetic justice in that, though I'm aware that poetic justice is not an adequate substitute for actual justice." "After you obtained the specimen, what did you do with it?" Miss Marple asked, though she believed she could already surmise the answer. "I maintained it in a secure container in my cottage on the Conservatory grounds," Margaret replied. "I cared for it carefully, providing appropriate food and environmental conditions, and I waited for an opportunity to place it where Dr. Thorne would encounter it. Dr. Winters had emphasised that timing was critical and that the method needed to appear accidental, or at least ambiguous in its origins." "Did Dr. Winters directly instruct you to kill Dr. Thorne?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm. "No," Margaret said carefully. "Dr. Winters never explicitly told me to deliver a lethal sting to the curator. She asked me to acquire the specimen. She provided me with information about Dr. Thorne's possible allergic vulnerabilities, and she asked me to consider whether I would be willing to prevent him from continuing his destructive activities. The actual decision to act and the method by which I acted was left to my judgment. Yet you must have understood what the logical conclusion of these actions would be," Miss Marple observed. "Yes," Margaret admitted. "I understood perfectly well that providing a deadly specimen to a man who Dr. Winters had indicated might have a severe allergic reaction was essentially planning his death. I understood this, and I allowed myself to proceed because I convinced myself that I was acting in defense of endangered species and in honor of my deceased partner's memory. I told myself that Dr. Thorne's activities were causing extinctions, that he was profiting from the destruction of species, and that removing him from the equation would prevent future harm. These rationalizations seemed sufficient at the time. How did you manage to place the butterfly in Dr. Thorne's office on the evening of the gala?" Miss Marple asked. "I knew that Dr. Thorne's office would be empty during the gala reception," Margaret replied. "I had access to the master key system, as do all permanent staff members. I also had the knowledge to handle a dangerous butterfly specimen safely, transporting it in a secure container without triggering a sting. I brought the specimen to the gala, waited until the reception was in full swing, and then made my way to Dr. Thorne's office. I had planned to simply release the butterfly in the office and allow it to encounter Dr. Thorne when he eventually returned to his workspace. Yet, the butterfly delivered its sting with remarkable efficiency," Miss Marple noted. "One might say with purposefulness that suggests more than mere chance encounter." "You're correct," Margaret said quietly. "I deliberately allowed the butterfly to land on Dr. Thorne's hand as he sat at his desk. I placed the specimen where I knew it would sting. I watched as the venom took effect, as his face registered the pain as he fell into shock, and I left him there to die without calling for medical assistance, even though I could have easily summoned help." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Margaret was confessing. This was not a case of someone acting in the heat of passion or in self-defense. This was a calculated murder, planned in detail, executed with deliberation, and observed to its fatal conclusion without intervention. "Does Dr. Winters know that you actually delivered the fatal sting?" Miss Marple asked, rather than merely placing the specimen where it might encounter Dr. Thorne by chance. "No," Margaret replied. "Dr. Winters was not present during the gala. When I informed her afterward that Dr. Thorne had died, I allowed her to believe that I had placed the specimen in his office, and that chance had done the rest. I never explicitly told her that I had directly caused the butterfly to sting him. However, she is not naive. She likely suspects that I did more than simply place a dangerous specimen in proximity to the curator." "And have you told anyone else of the actual nature of your involvement?" Miss Marple asked. "Only you," Margaret said. "No one else knows that I deliberately directed the butterfly to deliver a fatal sting. The police believe it was an accident. The butterfly encountered Dr. Thorne by chance in his office, and his unknown allergy resulted in the fatal reaction." Miss Marple rose slowly from the bench, her aged body moving with the careful deliberation of her years. "Margaret, you have committed a serious crime. You have taken a human life, however much you rationalize that action as necessary for conservation purposes. You must inform Inspector Willoughby of the truth regarding your involvement and your deliberate actions." "I know," Margaret said, and tears were now running freely down her face. "I know that I must face the consequences of what I've done. I've been preparing myself for this moment since the evening Dr. Thorne died. Part of me has been hoping that you, Miss Marple, would arrive at the truth and give me the opportunity to finally confess. I'm ready to face whatever judgment awaits me." Chapter 9. The Unravelling Web. Inspector Willoughby received Margaret Aldridge's full confession with the solemnity appropriate to such a serious disclosure. With Miss Marple present as a witness, Margaret provided a complete account of her involvement in Dr. Thorne's death, detailing every step from her initial conversation with Dr. Helena Winters through to her deliberate direction of the butterfly to deliver its fatal sting. The inspector conducted the interview with professional thoroughness, recording Margaret's statement and ensuring that she understood her rights regarding self-incrimination and legal representation. Yet even as Margaret completed her confession, Inspector Willoughby recognized that the full truth was more complex than a single confession could encompass. Margaret's actions had not occurred in isolation. She had been influenced, encouraged, and provided with resources by another individual, namely Dr. Helena Winters. The question now became not only whether Margaret would face criminal charges for her actions, but also what role Dr. Winters had played in planning Dr. Thorne's death. Inspector Willoughby immediately moved to secure Dr. Winters for questioning. However, when officers were dispatched to her residence, they discovered that the conservation officer had apparently departed Whitmore Bay early that morning, leaving behind a carefully composed note that served as a kind of secondary confession. Miss Marple was present when Inspector Willoughby read the note aloud, his voice steady despite the significance of what he was reading. The note contained admissions that Dr. Winters had indeed approached Margaret with the proposal to acquire a Heliconia Sara specimen, had provided Margaret with information about Dr. Thorne's potential allergic vulnerabilities, and had essentially orchestrated the circumstances that led to the curator's death. However, Dr. Winters had been careful in her language, neither explicitly ordering Margaret to commit murder, nor definitively stating that she had expected the butterfly to deliver a fatal sting. She had, in her mind, created plausible deniability regarding her role, even as her actions made clear her intention to end Dr. Thorne's life. In the note, Dr. Winters explained her reasoning with the clarity and moral certainty of someone who had justified her actions in her own mind with considerable conviction. She described in detail the endangered species that Dr. Thorne's activities had caused to be threatened with extinction. She outlined the millions of individual butterflies that had been removed from wild populations to satisfy the desires of wealthy collectors. She documented the ecological damage that had cascaded from these acquisitions, the disruption of pollination patterns, the destabilization of food chains, and the ultimate consequence of reduced wild populations that might never recover. She concluded her explanation by noting that Dr. Thorne's death, while tragic, represented the elimination of an obstacle to genuine conservation efforts. In her view, the moral calculus favoured the preservation of endangered species over the continued life of a single man whose existence was dedicated to their destruction. She acknowledged that this reasoning might appear to others as justification for murder, and she accepted the legal and moral consequences of her actions. However, she could not accept the continued operation of institutions that prioritize the profits of poachers and collectors over the survival of species. With the note as evidence of her involvement in the conspiracy to murder Dr. Thorne, international authorities were alerted to locate Dr. Winters, though she had seemingly vanished with the efficiency of someone prepared to flee. It was subsequently discovered that she had travelled to South America, using a variety of aliases and relying on conservation networks to facilitate her departure from official jurisdiction. As Inspector Willoughby prepared charges against both Margaret Aldridge and Dr. Helena Winters for conspiracy to commit murder and murder itself, Miss Marple sat quietly in the police station, contemplating the complex moral dimensions of the case she had helped to unravel. On the surface, the case appeared to be a straightforward murder investigation, yet the deeper one examined the circumstances, the more one encountered questions regarding the nature of justice, the validity of different moral perspectives, and the consequences of placing individual ethical judgment above the rule of law. Margaret Aldridge, driven by grief over her deceased partner and motivated by genuine concern for endangered species, had allowed herself to become an instrument of another person's will. She had convinced herself that participating in murder was justified by the larger cause of conservation. Yet, in doing so, she had crossed a line that separated ethical activism from criminal conspiracy. Dr. Helena Winters, while ostensibly acting from principle, had actually been engaging in a form of moral arrogance. She had decided, without authority or mandate from any legitimate institution, that Dr. Thorne's life was forfeit because his activities threatened species. She had then recruited another person to carry out that judgment. This, in Miss Marple's experienced view, represented a fundamental corruption of ethical principles, however righteous the initial motivation might appear. The murder of Dr. Thorne had not been an accident. It had not been a crime of passion committed in the heat of conflict. It had been a calculated act of environmental vigilantism, carried out by individuals who believed they possessed both the moral authority and the ethical obligation to execute what they considered a dangerous threat to the natural world. Yet Miss Marple also recognized that Dr. Thorne's own actions had been deeply wrong. His trafficking in endangered species, his contribution to extinctions, his placement of profit above conservation principles, these constituted genuine violations of the trust placed in those responsible for preserving species. The irony was that while Dr. Thorne's crimes had been discovered through official investigation and would eventually have resulted in prosecution and imprisonment, the response to those crimes had involved the very vigilante justice that undermined the rule of law. In the days following Margaret's confession and Dr. Winters's flight, Inspector Willoughby found himself in conversation with Miss Marple regarding the philosophical dimensions of the case. The two had developed considerable respect for one another through their collaboration, and the inspector was curious regarding Miss Marple's thoughts on the moral complexities that had emerged. "Do you believe Dr. Winters was correct in her assessment that Dr. Thorne represented such a threat to endangered species that his death was justified?" the inspector asked. Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe," she replied carefully, "that Dr. Thorne's actions were deeply wrong, and that his removal from a position of influence over conservation practices will result in benefits to endangered species. However, I also believe that the method used to remove him, and the justifications offered for that method, represent a corruption of legitimate ethical concerns. When we allow our moral convictions to override the requirements of law and established procedure, we begin a descent into a form of chaos where each individual becomes judge, jury, and executioner of those they deem worthy of punishment or elimination." The inspector nodded slowly. "So even though Dr. Thorne's crimes were genuine, even though his death may eventually benefit endangered species, the manner of his death represents a greater injustice than the injustice he was committing." "Yes," Miss Marple said. The greatest danger to the rule of law comes not from those who would openly defy it, but from those who would undermine it, through the assertion that their cause is sufficiently righteous to justify circumventing proper legal procedures. Once that principle is established, the foundation of civilization becomes unstable. Chapter 10. Patterns of Truth. 6 months after Dr. Thorne's death, the Grandview Tropical Conservatory underwent significant changes in its organizational structure and operational practices. The board of directors appointed a new curator who was committed to genuine conservation principles and to the elimination of all illegal species acquisition practices. The conservatory's relationship with international conservation organizations was rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and ethical operation. Gareth Ashford was promoted to lead the research division, his commitment to species protection finally recognized and valued. Margaret Aldridge stood trial for her role in Dr. Thorne's death. Her case attracted considerable media attention, with passionate arguments presented on both sides regarding whether her actions should be understood as acts of conservation heroism or criminal murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which testimony was presented regarding her motivations, her detailed planning, and her deliberate delivery of the fatal sting. The jury ultimately convicted her of murder, though they recommended leniency in sentencing given the circumstances and Margaret's apparent genuine remorse. Dr. Helena Winters was never captured and never returned to face trial. Rumours placed her in various South American countries, where she reportedly continued her conservation work under different identities, using her skills and expertise to protect endangered species outside the framework of official institutions. Whether she was guilty or innocent in the eyes of those who encountered her in her subsequent life remained a matter of individual judgment and perspective. Miss Marple declined several interview requests regarding the case and refused to provide details to media outlets hungry for sensational aspects of the story. Instead, she returned to her quiet life in her cottage, resuming her knitting and her gardening, though she found herself visited more frequently than before by those curious about her reputation as a solver of mysteries. It was on a spring day, nearly a year after the murder, that Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage. The visitor was none other than Gareth Ashford, who had travelled from Whitmore Bay to speak with her regarding certain matters that continued to trouble his conscience. They sat in Miss Marple's garden, surrounded by flowers beginning their spring bloom, and Ashford shared observations that he had made in the months following Dr. Winters's flight. "Miss Marple," he began, "I've discovered something that I felt obligated to share with you, even if I'm uncertain whether I should also share it with the authorities. In the months since Dr. Winters departed, I've examined the conservatory's records more thoroughly than ever before. I found evidence suggesting that Dr. Winters had not merely encouraged Margaret to kill Dr. Thorne, but that she had actively manipulated circumstances to ensure the murder would occur and would be difficult to investigate." "What specifically did you discover?" Miss Marple asked gently. Ashford explained that Dr. Winters had deliberately conducted her investigation of Dr. Thorne's illegal acquisitions in ways that would bring the threat to his attention without allowing him to successfully evade it. She had made her presence in Whitmore Bay sufficiently prominent that Dr. Thorne would be aware of her scrutiny. She had arranged for information regarding her investigation to reach various parties who would communicate that information to Dr. Thorne, creating psychological pressure that would make him increasingly fearful and desperate. Furthermore, Ashford continued, I discovered that Dr. Winters had enhanced the venom potency of the Heliconia sara specimen through certain laboratory procedures. The venom was deliberately concentrated to ensure a more severe allergic reaction than would naturally occur. She wasn't relying on chance or on Dr. Thorne's possible allergies. She was ensuring that the butterfly's sting would deliver a lethal dose. Miss Marple listened to this revelation with grave attention. What you're describing, she said slowly, is not merely murder, but premeditated murder with meticulous planning aimed at ensuring the death would occur and that the death would appear to be an accident. Yes, Ashford confirmed. Dr. Winters didn't propose a plan and leave the execution to Margaret's judgment. She specifically designed a plan to kill Dr. Thorne and recruited Margaret as an accomplice. The moral distinction I believed existed has largely disappeared upon closer examination. Miss Marple rose and moved to a flowering rosebush, examining the blooms with careful attention. "Have you informed Inspector Willoughby of these discoveries?" she asked. "No," Ashford admitted, "and I'm uncertain whether I should. Dr. Winters is beyond the reach of the law at this point, likely beyond capture or prosecution. Sharing this information would further complicate the legal proceedings against Margaret, potentially increasing her sentence. It would reveal details that are personally troubling to a woman who believed she was acting on principle, however misguided those principles ultimately proved to be." Miss Marple turned back to face the scientist. "You're asking me to advise you on whether to provide evidence to law enforcement," she observed. "In a sense, yes," Ashford replied. "I respect your judgment, and I'm uncertain how to proceed." Miss Marple returned to her seat and regarded Ashford with the patient wisdom of her years. "I cannot advise you whether to report these findings to the authorities," she said carefully. "That is a decision that rests within your own conscience. However, I can tell you something about my experience with these matters. Truth has a persistence that is difficult to deny. It may be concealed for a time, it may be distorted or misrepresented, but eventually truth tends to emerge. The question is not whether to reveal what you've discovered, but rather when, and to whom, and with what awareness of the consequences." Ashford left her cottage that afternoon with his question essentially unanswered, though somehow feeling that Miss Marple had provided him with clarity nonetheless. In the following weeks, he made his own decision regarding the information he had discovered, a decision that reflected his own moral convictions and his understanding of the complex consequences that truth can generate. Miss Marple, meanwhile, found herself returning once again to her knitting, a complex pattern that she had been working on for several months. As her needles clicked with the rhythmic familiarity of years of practice, she found herself reflecting on the case that had consumed so much of her attention and emotional energy. The murder of Dr. Thorne, like all of the murders she had encountered over her long life, had revealed the deep complexity of human motivation and moral judgment. On the surface, it appeared that a conservation officer and a grieving gardener had conspired to murder a corrupt curator in order to protect endangered species. Yet the deeper examination revealed a far more complicated moral landscape, where genuine ethical concerns coexisted with the misuse of power, where principle could become an excuse for vigilantism, and where the line between justice and murder could become obscured by conviction and certainty. The butterflies that had been so central to this case had their own lessons to offer. They had arrived at the conservatory through networks of acquisition that spanned continents and involved complex agreements between collectors, smugglers, and scientists. Their presence in captivity had triggered the events that led to murder. The particular species used as the instrument of death had itself become a symbol of the larger conflicts between conservation and exploitation that had motivated so much of the case. As spring progressed into summer and summer faded toward autumn, the Grandview Tropical Conservatory settled into its new existence under reformed management and ethical practices. The butterfly exhibitions continued to attract visitors, though now the specimens on display had been obtained through legitimate channels and housed in conditions designed genuinely to benefit the species rather than satisfy collectors' desires for rarity. Margaret Aldridge served her prison sentence with quiet dignity, participating in programs aimed at rehabilitation and education. She eventually began writing about her experience, attempting to articulate how genuine ethical commitment could be corrupted by grief and by the influence of others with their own hidden agendas. Her writing, while not excusing her actions, provided valuable perspective on how intelligent, well-meaning people could be led toward criminal acts through a combination of emotional vulnerability and moral persuasion. Dr. Helena Winters remained beyond the reach of formal justice, though she continued her conservation work in regions where species protection remained a desperate struggle against exploitation and extinction. Whether she found peace in her chosen exile, whether she continued to believe that her actions had been justified, remained unknown to those who had known her in Whitmore Bay. And Miss Marple, having brought another mystery to its conclusion, found herself once again at peace with the world around her, secure in the knowledge that truth, however painful, had ultimately prevailed. She understood that justice, When it finally arrived, often carried with it complications and moral ambiguities that defied the neat resolutions favoured by those who read mysteries for simple entertainment. In her final thoughts on the case, shared only with Raymond during a quiet visit to her cottage, Miss Marple offered this observation. The remarkable thing about crimes, particularly murders, is how they illuminate the complexity of human nature and the depths of conviction that people are willing to sacrifice for their beliefs. Dr. Thorne was a criminal, yet his death was not justice, but merely another crime. Margaret Aldridge was a woman of genuine principle, yet her commitment to conservation was corrupted into complicity in murder. Dr. Winters was a dedicated scientist, yet her moral certainty became a kind of arrogance that allowed her to decide who lived and who died. In the end, there are no simple villains and heroes in such matters, only human beings struggling with the consequences of their choices and their convictions. The butterflies at the Grandview Tropical Conservatory continue their existence, unaware of the human dramas that had swirled around them. They flutter and dance, seeking nectar, continuing the great cycles of life that extend far beyond the concerns of human justice and morality. In their delicate beauty and their subtle complexity, they offer a kind of wisdom that transcends the legal and moral frameworks within which humans attempt to create order. They simply continue, living their brief lives with the remarkable grace that characterizes all of nature. And with that observation, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm that had accompanied her through countless cases and countless years, creating patterns of meaning and beauty from seemingly simple threads, much as she had drawn truth from the tangled threads of human motivation and deception. The end. As we conclude our time at Mindful Musings, I want to thank you, dear listener, for joining me on this journey through the mystery of death at the Butterfly Conservatory. The tale of Miss Marple, the endangered species, and the complex moral dilemmas surrounding conservation and justice reminds us that truth is rarely simple and justice is rarely clean. Miss Marple teaches us that careful observation, patience, and understanding of human nature remain our greatest tools for discerning truth from deception. Until we meet again in another tale of mystery and human complexity, I remain your devoted host, William, reminding you to observe the world around you carefully, to listen to the stories that people reveal through their actions and their words, and to remember that every mystery, properly examined, contains within it valuable lessons about the nature of the human heart. Thank you for your attention, and may your next cup of tea be as warming as the understanding that comes from seeing clearly into the hearts of those around us.